It started in the town of Delta right outside of the county. The year 1890 had led to the end of an expansive era for the United States of America. The closing of the frontier and the long-fated gold rush out west 30-some years buried in dust and failure had once been thought to mark the final breath of the banker empires and Wall Street's reach. But human greed doesn't die. It changes shape. And in Delta, it took a shape that barely resembled human at all. The town was modest, nestled among the folds of hill country and shrouded in fog most mornings. The rail line had never made it quite far enough to make Delta matter, and the river was too thin and too crooked to carry much freight. Still, it survived on mining, mostly. And mining meant money, and money meant men who had none of it were willing to crawl deep into the dark to find it. They dug where the land had given way once before a shallow collapse in a limestone shelf, rumored to have swallowed a wagon train back in the 1840s. No one ever found the wagons. No bones, either. Just black air and the quiet sound of water dripping somewhere down in the dark. Come winter, they cracked into something older than stone. The first man who came out of the shaft raving was a Czech immigrant named Emil Krupa. He had clawed his own eyes out with rusted nails before they got him to the surface. Claimed he saw faces in the stone, said they whispered in a tongue older than blood. The town doctor said it was gas. The priest said it was punishment. The mayor said it was none of his concern, just another madman too long underground. They filled the shaft in. Paid the crew extra to keep quiet. For a week, it worked. Then the snow came early. It didn't fall like snow ought to. It came down in shards, wet, heavy, clinging to windows like something alive. The air itself grew dense. The miners stopped showing up at home. Dogs went missing. Then a child 8-year-old Ellie Winslow disappeared on her way back from the feed store. Her father found only her mittens, soaked through and stiff with something that wasn't quite blood. No one went looking past sundown. A group of men, former soldiers from the war, set out with rifles and kerosene. Only 2 came back. One couldn't speak. The other wouldn't stop shaking. He said the thing that took Ellie wore her face. But it was wrong. Like something had built her from memory but got the bones all twisted up. After that, Delta sealed itself in. Barred doors. Boarded windows. The church rang its bell day and night. But the sound didn't carry far. Not in that snow. Not through that air. The tracks that showed up in the yards weren't from boots. They looked more like hooves. Or hands. Or both. By mid-December, Delta stopped sending mail. The telegraph office burned down. No one came to rebuild it. People said they could hear breathing in the attic, in the walls, under the floorboards. And in the dead of night, when the wind died and the world held still, there were voices in the fields. Voices that knew your name. And they were always hungry. And after a few months of silence, the United States government finally took notice. It wasn't the missing telegraphs that did it. Wasn't even the lack of tax receipts. It was the train that never came back. A military cargo engine out of Harrisburg, tasked with delivering survey equipment to the Southern Ridge, last seen pulling into Delta Station with a crew of 5. It never reported in. No distress. No sign of trouble. That's when they sent the agents. 2 men from the Department of the Interior, flanked by a rail marshal and a civilian geologist. They arrived in the early thaw, armed with maps, revolvers, and polite authority. What they found waiting was nothing short of nightmare. Delta was gone. Not burned. Not buried. Just empty. As if every soul had stood up mid-meal and vanished into the trees. Tables were still set. Lamps still burned low with dying oil. A pot of stew had rotted down to paste on a stove that hadn't gone cold in weeks. Livestock cages hung open. Church pews sat undisturbed under a film of dust and mold. But it was more than the emptiness. It was the wrongness. Blood, dark, dried, but unmistakable, trailed across wood floors and faded out at doorways like something had been dragged, then lifted. A child's boot print on the ceiling of the sheriff's office. Scratches on the inside of cellar doors. Claw marks on window frames. And in the center of town, nailed to the bell tower with rusted mining spikes, was a deer's skull split clean down the middle. The agents didn't speak much on the ride back. Only the geologists stayed behind, insisting on checking the old limestone fault on the edge of town. They found his field bag 3 days later. It was empty. Except for a torn page from his notebook. Scrawled in charcoal were the words. It watches from the walls. Don't dig. Don't listen. Don't say its name. There was no signature. No blood. Just those words, and a single hoof print pressed deep into the frost-damp earth beside it. A hoof print. With 5 toes. However, there was something, just something found back in the town of Delta. A sign. A trace. The only clue that anything had ever come into the town from the outside. In the back of what used to be the old boarding house, tucked beneath rotted floorboards and dragged halfway out like something tried to bury it in a hurry, the agents found bags. Weathered, stitched tight with old leather cord. Inside, scattered gold pieces. A few bars. Some cracked, others stamped crisp with the U.S. Mint seal. Not fresh. But not ancient either. The dates? 1851, 1852. 1855. Dead center of the final years of the California gold rush. And they weren't dusty with age. They were clean. Moved recently. A miner's ledger half-burned lay beside the bags, its ink still legible, listing claims in counties that hadn't existed in decades. One name was circled 3 times in red: Bellwether Claim, Dead Mule Pass. Nobody could explain how gold from the Pacific frontier wound up stashed in a collapsed mining town on the eastern edge of Pennsylvania. And within just a few weeks of Delta's discovery, strange things began to happen across the western edge of Lancaster County. First, it was the livestock. Cattle found dead with their hooves missing. Pigs refusing to eat, staring at the woods like something was watching them. Then came the dreams, dozens of people across Drumore and Mardyck townships reporting the same figures in the night. Tall, emaciated silhouettes at the tree line. Sometimes just one. Sometimes many. Then the voices. Low. Crooked. Like something trying to remember how people spoke. Calling out names. Names of the dead. No one dared cross west past the Susquehanna after dark. Not anymore. Because whatever took Delta was moving east. But soon, it wasn't just livestock. The town of Little Britain, quiet, rural, hemmed in by forest and farmland, had its own encounter with whatever had come crawling out of the dark. It began one night, without warning. No storm. No strange lights. Just a sound. A deep, groaning noise like the trees themselves were aching. Windows rattled. Dogs howled. And then came the pounding doors, shutters, walls, as if the night had hands. People screamed. Lanterns lit up. Shots were fired into the black, though no one saw what they were shooting at. Something scraped across roofs. Something breathed against the glass. And then it was gone. By morning, the people of Little Britain emerged from their homes in a haze, exhausted, shaken, some bloodied, but alive. Alive, except for one house. The Malloway family lived on the western edge of town. A quiet couple, Daniel and Ruth, and their two children, Tommy and Elsie. When the townsfolk reached the Malloway home, the front door was hanging open. Inside, the kitchen was torn apart, the walls splintered, claw-deep with gouges that no animal native to Pennsylvania could have made. The hallway bore drag marks. Dried blood. But it was the children's room that no one ever forgot. Daniel Moser, a blacksmith by trade and no stranger to war, was the first inside. He didn't last 5 seconds. He stumbled out and vomited in the yard. Others followed. All of them left the same way. No one would speak of what they saw. Not in detail. Not even to the preacher. Only that it wasn't just a killing. It was wrong. Twisted. Something done with purpose and without mercy. The room was sealed. The windows boarded. The house fenced off with wood and iron. And that night, and every night since, the people of Little Britain gathered in the church. They sang louder now, kept the candles lit longer, and no one let their children sleep alone. And soon, throughout the rest of Lancaster County, stories like what happened in Little Britain stopped being rare. For a brief, harrowing stretch of weeks, they became commonplace. It started at the edges, rural plots near the tree lines, single homes far off the main roads. Families waking to guttural sounds outside their walls. Scratching beneath floorboards. Whispers in voices that should have been familiar but weren't. In East Drumore, a midwife was found wandering barefoot down a gravel lane at dawn, her gown soaked and torn. She kept repeating one word: hungry. In Conestoga Township, a young couple's farmhouse was found with the front door missing entirely, not open, but missing, ripped off the frame like paper. The couple was never found. Only the crib remained. Empty. There were no patterns in who it struck. Rich, poor, German, English, farmstead or small town. But the signs were always the same. Strange tracks in the mud that didn't match any living animal. Doors left wide open despite locks. Rooms colder than the air outside. Furniture turned to face walls or corners. And always a silence afterward that made the wind feel too loud. In Strasbourg, the town bell began to ring every night at sundown. In Quarryville, whole neighborhoods formed armed watches. People started placing iron nails in their door frames. Children were made to sleep with matches and salt pouches under their pillows. The sheriff's office stopped taking statements. There were too many. And nothing to follow up on. Then came the burning. 3 homes in 3 different townships set ablaze before dawn by their own families. Survivors claimed the homes had been marked. That something had been inside. And they chose to torch the walls rather than wait to see what came next. For a short time, all across Lancaster County, the people lived like prey. And somewhere out beyond the Susquehanna, in the western woods, the thing that had come out of Delta kept moving. Closer. Whatever the hell these things were, one truth began to settle over the county, spoken in whispers, passed between families, murmured from pulpits and back porches alike. They weren't acting alone. The attacks, the disappearances, the mutilations, none of it felt random. These weren't beasts stumbling through the woods. This was patterned, planned. They moved like a unit. Not in formation but in instinct. Fast. Coordinated. Intelligent. They circled homes before striking. Isolated the vulnerable. Broke lines of sight. Disabled lanterns and killed dogs first. They would watch for hours, days before ever making a move. And when they did, it was always clean. Always total. Always final. No one ever saw more than a blur, a shadow, a silhouette between trees, but the stories matched too well to be ignored. People started calling them a pack. Not a herd. Not a swarm. A pack. Some even claimed they followed a hierarchy, said one was bigger, faster, gave the orders without words. Said it stood straighter. Watched longer. Said when it passed, the wind stopped. No one could prove it. There were no tracks to follow, no eyes to meet, no bodies to bury. Just the after effects. The smell. The silence. Theories ran wild. A family. A hive. A cult cursed to walk like beasts. Soldiers from some old war who never died right. But behind all the rumors, one fact refused to die. There weren't many of them, but there were too many. Too many for anyone to face. Too many to fight off. Too many to sleep soundly. Because once you understood how they hunted, you realized they weren't hunting at random. They were working their way in. Not even the borders of Lancaster City itself were safe from these nightmares. For a time, the city had felt distant, untouchable in its brick and cobble, its gas lights and patrols, its thick stone churches and clattering trolley cars. People told themselves it was too big, too loud, too modern for the horrors in the woods. They were wrong. It started in the south, the outer neighborhoods where the farmlands still crept close and the forest lines pressed hard against back fences. A watchman disappeared off his route near Broad Street. A mother swore she saw something watching from the tree line behind her shed. Children began waking up with bloody noses and no memory of the night. Then came the alley incident in the Cabbage Hill district. 3 men found dead behind a tavern, torn apart in ways that made the city doctor resign the same week. The local paper ran the headline, "Animal attack suspected." But nobody bought it. There was no animal alive that could peel a man open like that and leave no tracks. Soon, the outer wards began locking down at sundown. The city guard tried to play it quiet, tried to manage panic, but too many people were seeing the same thing. Tall, thin shapes moving across rooftops. Hollow eyes in storm drains. And the smell. Rotting pine, wet fur, and meat left too long in the sun. Even the old tunnels beneath the city, once used for steam, now long sealed, started echoing with movement. Scratching. Clicking. Things that didn't belong underground. The mayor declared a state of heightened alert. Curfews were quietly implemented. Churches filled. Ammunition sold out. Still, it wasn't enough. Because the truth was simple. The things that took Delta. The things that stalked Little Britain. The things that moved like family and hunted like thought. They had come to the city. And they weren't leaving. One night, a girl was attacked in the woods just beyond the city line between Lancaster and Millersville, near the old creek where the trees grow tight and the ground never fully dries, even in summer. She had wandered too far. Looking for her dog, she said. It was after dusk, and the wind had gone still. She never heard it approach. By the time she realized she was being hunted, it was already behind her. Tall. Fast. Wrong. She ran, caught branches in her face, thorns in her arms. Said it didn't make noise when it moved, just the sound of leaves pulling away, like the woods themselves were trying to let it through. It caught her once. Clawed her shoulder. Tore through flesh like it wasn't there. She fell. She should have died. But she didn't. She crawled, limped, and then, somehow, made it to the clearing. There, at the edge of a hill, stood an old house black against the moonlight, half-rotted, leaning, long forgotten. Stone foundation, brick walls, wide porch. The kind of place that wasn't on any modern map. She said the thing chasing her stopped cold. Didn't scream. Didn't growl. Just halted. As if something in that clearing held it back. She said it stood at the edge of the trees, shaking, not from fear but from fury. It circled, once. Tried to step forward. Then turned. And left. She passed out on the porch. A passing road crew found her at dawn, still bleeding, barely alive. Dozens of stitches. Broken ribs. A collapsed lung. But she lived. The only person to survive a direct encounter. When asked what she saw, she couldn't bring herself to name it. But she described it in detail: tall, skeletal, eyes like broken glass, and a mouth that opened too wide, full of something moving. Skin like stretched parchment over bone. Claws. Antlers. The smell of snow and rot. Everything but the name. And when asked how she survived, she only said, "I was by that house." The old one. Said to be older than the country itself. Used to belong to a redcoat officer, they say. There was a slaughter there, long ago. I don't know why it stopped. I just know it did. No one asked her more. No one went back to that house. Not yet. These creatures, whatever they were, didn't vanish after that. They didn't retreat, didn't wither in the face of prayer or bullets or torchlight. They lingered, waited, and watched. For months, then years, Lancaster County lived under their shadow. Towns tried to move on. Families rebuilt. New roads were paved. Telegraphs were repaired. But every so often, someone would vanish. A dog would be found gutted in the snow. A window would crack inward, not from impact, but pressure. And someone in the township would start hearing voices that sounded like they're dead. By the time the century turned 1900, loud and full of promises, the fear had almost become background noise. People stopped speaking of it directly. Just locked their doors tighter and passed on old rituals without explanation. Iron charms on the porch. Mirrors facing windows. Salt in boots by the hearth. But the monsters hadn't forgotten. And neither had their hunger. Because when the new century arrived, it brought something fresh into the air: greed. Rail lines multiplied. Land speculators came east from Pittsburgh and west from Philadelphia. The coal barons, the steel magnates, the paper men, they all wanted a piece of what still lay untouched in the hills and forests. Old farms were bought and split. Timber contracts were signed. A syndicate out of New York even petitioned to drill near the Susquehanna banks for rare minerals. And with every deal inked in back rooms, with every parcel of land cleared and fenced and sold, the woods got quieter. Too quiet. The more man took, the more they came back. And they didn't just hunt now. They reacted. To greed. To desecration. To the violation of places that should have been left buried. They were drawn to it like carrion birds to blood. And if you really listened, you'd hear the stories again. Miners vanishing in soft soil. Engineers found torn in half on rail beds. Surveyors never returning from tree lines that should have been safe. Because whatever ancient force stirred in Delta, it didn't die. It fed. And nothing feeds it better than the bottomless want of man. That was the theory, anyway. Among the folks of Lancaster County, it became a kind of quiet gospel. It started in Delta. That town out past the county line, just far enough to forget, just close enough to still feel breathing down your neck. Whatever those things were, however many of them there were, they'd come from there. Crawled out of that mine shaft, maybe. Or from deeper. Somewhere older. Somewhere never meant to be touched. But no one ever confirmed it. Not really. Oh, there were rumors. Government men showing up in unmarked carriages. A priest who went out and never came back. Stories of lights seen on the ridge, of screams that sounded too much like laughter echoing through the fog. But nothing official. No headlines. No answers. And by the time the 1910s rolled around, the world had other problems. The gears of something bigger, colder had started grinding in Europe. Empires flexed. Assassins took aim. Flags rose. Blood spilled. The First World War loomed heavy on the horizon like a thunderhead swallowing the sun. And suddenly, Delta wasn't a priority. The country was shifting. Armies were forming. Newspapers were screaming about Sarajevo, about Germany, about alliances, and duty and honor. The old ghosts didn't fit into the new century. No one had the time. No one had the will. And maybe most of all, no one had the cojones to go out there and prove the theory right. Because if they did, if someone did go out to Delta and didn't come back, then all those stories, all the warnings, all the blood, all the nightmares hiding behind the silence, wouldn't be stories anymore. They'd be history. And the kind no war could explain away. But there was still something about that old house. It stands to this day leaning slightly, its bricks weathered but intact, its roof patched enough to keep the bones dry. The land around it doesn't look the same anymore. Where once there were dense woods and creeping vines, now there are sidewalks, street lamps, and the slow crawl of suburban sprawl. Lancaster's edge has stretched out. Millersville has grown in kind. And in between, the forest has been pushed back bit by bit, cleared for roads, homes, schools. All except that house. No one goes near it. Not the surveyors. Not the teenagers with something to prove. Not even the county crews tasked with clearing old plots. Every plan that's ever tried to include that land ends up quietly scrapped. Files disappear. Equipment breaks. Workers walk off the job. And the creatures they don't come close. They skirt it. Avoid the hill entirely. No tracks, no signs, not a whisper of them ever crossing the boundary of that old, crumbling fence. Like the house radiates something they recognize and fear. But nobody knows why. Sure, there are stories, old Lancaster rumors passed down in half-truths and hearth whispers. Tales of a British officer and a woman who housed revolutionaries. Of betrayal. A midnight slaughter. Blood in the nursery. Some say the woman was pregnant. Others say she was holding a musket when they found her, still warm. None of it ever made it into the official histories. But the bones of it stuck. Still, no one can explain why that matters now. The monsters don't care about churches. Don't care about armed men. Don't care about prayer or law or fences. But they care about that house. And that's enough for most people. Nobody wants to go near it. Nobody lives on that hill. The closest homes sit with their back doors facing away, curtains drawn tight at dusk. The kids don't trick or treat there. The realtors don't offer it up. And even the bravest souls in the county, the ones who hunt, the ones who know, won't set foot past that fence unless it's noon and the sky is clear. It's not a solution. It's not a weapon. And you sure as hell can't cram a whole county into a rotted out, two-room remnant of the 1700s. But for whatever reason, that house is off limits. To everyone. And everything. And unfortunately, the slaughter didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. The war took the men. Took the strong backs, the rifles, the steady nerves. Took the farmers, the blacksmiths, the sheriffs, the sons. Europe burned, and Lancaster County bled in silence quietly, far from the headlines. All that was left behind were the too old and the too young. Widows, mothers, children with hands too small to hold a barrel steady. The towns tried to organize watches, rusted revolvers, oil lamps, dogs on chains, but it was never enough. You can't outgun what doesn't leave footprints. You can't outwatch what lives in silence. And when the nights came deep and cold and full of whispering wind, the homes locked up tighter than vaults. Curtains drawn. Candles burned low. Some families moved into their root cellars and slept there every night. Still, it came. It came to Mountville. To Bart. To Salunga. Quiet corners of the county that didn't make the papers but were remembered by name. It tore through homes like parchment. Took entire households. Sometimes left one behind just to hear them scream about it in church the next morning. There was no cavalry coming. No telegrams answered. The country was too busy burying boys in France. So the old men did what they could. Patched together barricades. Dug trenches around barns like it was 1776 again. Some went mad with fear, some disappeared on their own terms. The mothers, they got mean. Quiet mean. They learned to fight dirty. They hid blades in cribs, rigged traps along window sills. They whispered old prayers into walls no priest had heard in decades. Some of them worked. Some of them didn't. And the children, well, they grew up fast. Learned to keep their heads down. Learned not to follow voices at night. Learned that the stories weren't stories. Learned that monsters didn't live under the bed. They watched the windows. But none of it was enough. Because these things they knew. They knew when the county was weakest. They knew when the blood was ripe and unguarded. And they came like hunger on legs, all teeth and frost and silence. There was no fight to win. Only waiting. Waiting for the war to end. Waiting for the men to return. Waiting for the bodies to be found before they turned to nothing. And in the meantime, Lancaster County did what it had always done. It endured. Alone. And then something unexpected. It happened again. Much like that girl all those years ago, the one who fled through the woods, bleeding, haunted, barely breathing. Another woman found herself cornered. It was deeper into the war years now, and the hills were dry, the trees brittle, the air thick with heat. She was out past where she should have been. Got turned around near dusk. By the time she realized it, she wasn't alone. It chased her fast. Antlers wide, breath hot, and rancid. It crashed through brush, tearing the woods apart behind her. She ran like death was a breath behind her, because it was. She saw the house. Still there. Still abandoned. Still quiet. And for reasons she'd never be able to explain, she ran in. But this time, the thing didn't stop. It followed. Dragged its twisted limbs up the steps, pushed its way through the crooked doorway. Its antlered head ducked low as it crept inside, joints popping, breath steaming in the heat. The floor groaned beneath it. And then, the ravens. A storm of wings, sudden and sharp, burst across the broken rafters. Black feathers in the candlelight. The sound echoed like a warning. The creature froze. Because from the far corner of the room, where the dust hadn't settled, something stared back. Eyes. Glowing not like fire, not like the creature's own, but steady. Human. A figure stood there. Loosely built. Young. Not a child, not yet weathered by age. Draped in the garb of a time-long buried worn coat, buckled boots, layers frayed by time and use. A sash. A powder horn. A musket in one hand. A hatchet in the other. The air in the room changed. Though it was July, it suddenly felt like January. Breath turned visible. Boards cracked with cold. The shadows pulled inward like they were afraid. The man-boy stood motionless, watching, unblinking. And the woman, still cowering by the hearth, heard him speak. One sentence. Calm. Even. Measured like a prayer wrapped in a thread. Tell me, nightmares, are you afraid of the dark yet? Then the shot. Loud. Final. The flint sparked, the musket roared, and the creature shrieked. Not from pain. From fear. It tore backward through the doorway, antlers scraping the frame, limbs scrambling, crashing through the field beyond like a beast newly birthed into terror. When she looked up, the figure was gone. No sound. No wind. Just feathers on the floor and the kind of cold that settles deep in the bone. And after that night, the creatures didn't come near the house again. They remembered. The residents of Lancaster County. They'd always prided themselves on their roots, on their soil, on their faith and farms and generations buried in the same earth they tilled. But now that pride was curdling into something else. Because something wasn't right with this place anymore. Hadn't been for a long time. They didn't say it out loud. They didn't dare. But it crept into their voices, into the silence between conversations, into the looks passed over dinner tables and at town meetings. A tension that went beyond fear. Confusion. What the hell were they living in? This wasn't just a haunted patch of woods. It wasn't just one creature. It wasn't just old myths. It was something layered. Stacked. Like the ground itself had forgotten how to be just dirt. You had monsters. You had things that hunted in packs. You had disappearances. You had that house. You had that thing in the house. That boy. That ghost or whatever he was, dressed like a memory that refused to die. And now ravens, flocks of them, black as night, not native to the region, were roosting in places no birds had ever roosted. Courthouses. Barn roofs. Church steeples. Watching. Like sentinels. No matter how far you went, north to Ephrata, west to Columbia, east to Leola, you still felt it. Like the ground had grown eyes. Like the sky was waiting for something. And more people were going missing. Not just farmers. Whole families. Hunters who knew every tree and every trail. Wagons found empty. Horses still hitched. Not a sound. So they started asking the questions. What is this land? What lives under it? What woke up in it? What still walks it? Because this wasn't just a haunted county. It wasn't just cursed. It felt designed. Like something bigger had claimed this patch of Pennsylvania. Something ancient. Something angry. Something that liked to watch. They didn't have a name for it. They didn't want one. But whatever Lancaster County had become, it sure as hell wasn't just Lancaster anymore. And as the monsters claimed more lives one by one, family by family, blood soaking deeper into the roots of the land, another sound began to follow in their wake. Gong. 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 A bell. A church bell. Not just once. Not just in one place. It echoed across the county, through hills and hollows, through farmland and frost, cutting clean through the fog like it was tolling for the dead. But the thing is, no one knew where it came from. Sometimes it was heard just before a slaughter. Sometimes just after. But always near. Always close. And stranger still, it rang in places where there were no churches. Old barns. Abandoned mills. Forest clearings with nothing but moss and stone. Places where no steeple ever stood, and no bell had ever been cast. People heard it in the middle of fields. In basements. In the woods. No echo. No source. Just that low, drawn-out gong, deep enough to rattle window panes and shake the nerves raw. And each time the creatures struck again, the bell got louder. And louder. And louder. Until it didn't sound like just a warning anymore. It sounded like a countdown. Folks tried to rationalize it. Maybe some old mission bell left standing somewhere. Maybe the wind playing tricks. Maybe just fear echoing in the mind. But the dogs heard it. The children heard it. The deaf didn't. And the land? It listened. Some said it was a signal. Others said it was a record tolling for each soul lost. And a few, only the oldest, only the ones who remembered the way Delta used to be, said the bell wasn't warning us. It was warning them. That something older still had eyes on this place. And every time the bell tolled, it was keeping score. Then came the summer where everything changed. The bell rang 13 times in 1 week. 13 gongs. 13 deaths. Or what passed for deaths. Bodies weren't always found anymore. Sometimes it was just blood. Sometimes only a scream, heard from miles off, with no source ever discovered. Sometimes just silence where noise should be. And each time, the bell followed. People stopped counting it as a coincidence. They started writing it down. Marking times. Drawing maps. The county libraries, long ignored, saw their shelves combed through for anything old land records, battle journals, missionary travel logs, folk medicine guides, sermons from before the country was even a country. And a pattern began to emerge. Every place the bell was heard, everywhere the monsters attacked, lined up along a crooked, winding path. Not straight. Not clean. But connected. And at the center of that invisible shape, the house. Of course it was. That damned old house that had stood for centuries without crumbling. That no one claimed, no one fixed, no one trespassed. It was the pivot of something no one had the language for. But it got worse. Because one night, the bell didn't ring 13 times. It rang once. Then again. And again. And again. 37 gongs. The county didn't sleep. Entire towns lit fires in the fields and stayed awake on porches with rifles they didn't remember loading. And when morning came, nothing. No screams. No new graves. Until the mailman reached Peach Bottom. No bodies. No blood. Just every house empty. Coffee still hot. Pipes still warm. Doors wide open. No signs of a struggle. But 37 people were simply gone. And from then on, the bell changed. It started ringing before attacks. At first minutes before. Then hours. Then days. As if something was building. Growing. Preparing. As if the bell wasn't just counting anymore. It was announcing. And in one of the last entries scribbled into the margin of an old preacher's notebook found in Strasbourg, just before the entire church went dark. If the bell tolls and no one listens, the ground will open its mouth. From that point forward, every time the bell rang, people moved, packed up, left entire neighborhoods. Whole families fled north. Some vanished on the road. Some made it out. Some turned back. But those who stayed behind, they started whispering something new. Not about the monsters. Not even about the bell. About the one who stood in its path. The boy. The man. The figure in the frost. The one with the eyes and the musket. The one the nightmares feared. They didn't know his name. But some had begun calling the place he appeared the threshold. And as the bells grew louder, and the monsters bolder, whispers spread of one final truth. He doesn't come to stop the creatures. He comes when something worse is on the way. It happened on a Tuesday. Late summer. Heavy air. Thunder on the horizon. A family, a father, a mother, and their son no older than 8 came running from the tree line at the southern edge of Lancaster City. Torn clothes. Blood on their faces. Eyes wide with that unmistakable look. They had seen it. Whatever it was had chased them from farmland into asphalt and iron. They ran past trolleys, over cobblestone, through alleys, and into the shell of one of the new loom mills, a massive place, all brick and riveted steel, rows of quiet machines waiting for sunrise. They thought the machines, the walls, the city itself would keep them safe. They were wrong. The thing followed. It didn't hesitate at the edge of the woods. It crossed over. Long-limbed. Starved. Antlered. Eyes gleaming with the sick kind of intelligence that knows what a hunt is. And worse, what it means to make it last. Inside the mill, it crept. The lights were dead. The machines were cold. The building groaned from its own emptiness. The family hid beneath one of the looms, hearts pounding, breathing ragged, the smell of hot oil still clinging to the walls. And they could hear it. The slow scratch of claws on concrete. Sniffing. Snorting. Finding them. And then everything stopped. The creature froze. Because it wasn't alone in the dark. Across the factory floor, half shrouded in shadow and humming fluorescence, stood a figure. Tall. Still. Silent. Eyes glowing not white, not blue, but sharp. Electric. Watching. No musket. No tricorn. No smell of old blood or winter wind. This wasn't a ghost of the past. This was something else. This one wore denim. A hoodie, torn at the cuff. Faded sneakers stained with soot and rain. Hands loose at his sides like he'd been waiting all night for the right moment to make his point. And in one of those hands gleaming under the failing lights was a weapon no one in that time should have had. A .44 Magnum. Sleek. Heavy. Chrome like the moon on fire. The creature snarled, rising to its full height, antlers nearly brushing the iron beams above. And that's when the man spoke. Voice low. Calm. Familiar somehow. Not angry. Just tired of waiting. Tell me, nightmares. Are you afraid of the dark yet? The shot that followed was louder than anything a loom could scream. The beast howled, screamed not in pain, but in terror. Its body crashed through machinery, scrambling, crawling, tearing its way back out the way it came, like hell itself was at its heels. And when the family dared to look up, he was already gone. No footprints. No sound. Just a wisp of smoke and a single bullet casing still spinning on the floor. Whatever that thing was that chased them, it would think twice before ever entering the city again. Because now, something else was watching. Something not from the past. Not quite from the future. But very much here. And the dark belonged to him. And that's when it finally began to happen. The bells, those awful, unseen, impossible bells, began to gong, not just before death, but in defiance. As the monsters crept from woods and creek beds and crumbled cellar doors, they found something waiting for them now. Not fear. Not flight. But resistance. Sightings began all across Lancaster County. First in Leacock Township. Then Paradise. Then out by the old burned chapel in Mardickville. People spoke of a boy young, quiet, dressed in strange, threadbare garb like he had stepped out of a war fought before photography. They said he came with frost in the heat, that the air turned to ice when he stepped from the shadows. His eyes glowed faint and blue like the glint of flint against iron. He never said much. Sometimes nothing at all. But he never missed. Creatures that crossed into his path didn't get warnings. They got cold lead, and a second chance to run if they were lucky. Those who weren't, well, the crows got quiet after. And then, there was the man. Older. Not by much, but more present. Like a figure caught between two worlds, dressed like one of their own but carrying himself like something far more dangerous. Worn boots. Modern clothes layered like armor. The weapon in his hand, no one knew what it was, only that it lit up the night and dropped beasts that had once torn through entire families like paper. He moved fast. Moved hard. Always showed up when things were at their worst. And when it was over, he was always gone before sunrise. Just a shadow. A crack in the concrete. A casing left behind, still warm. Some people claim to have seen the two of them together, once. A moment. A flash. The boy in frost and the man in fire, standing at opposite ends of a cornfield torn by something not human. Nothing lived in that field anymore. And the monsters, these things that had once ruled the night like apex predators, they were changing. Growing cautious. Pulling back. They still hunted, but it wasn't with impunity. They were looking over their shoulders now. Because something had snapped. Something had had enough. And now, when the bells tolled, they didn't mark doom. They marked a warning. Not for the people. For the monsters. The change wasn't loud. It wasn't celebrated. No one held meetings. No one passed laws. But across Lancaster County, things shifted. People still locked their doors at night. Still prayed. Still listened for footsteps that didn't belong. But now, they also listened for the bell. Because it had changed its rhythm. It didn't just toll before tragedy. Now it tolled before judgment. The first time a creature was found dead, truly, fully, permanently dead, was just outside Marietta. The thing had been torn apart, but not like animals tear. This was surgical. Intentional. Left behind. Displayed. Its bones arranged. Its body folded neatly, with its own antlers driven through its spine. Pinned like a specimen. Like a message. And that wasn't the last. All through the backwoods and river roads, they began to appear. Not just bodies. Warnings. Charred claw marks that stopped inches from children's windows. Antlers snapped and left in church pews. A blood trail that circled an entire farmhouse without a single breach. And each time after, someone would report having seen one of them. The boy, pale as a blizzard, standing at the end of a long dirt lane, frost collecting at his feet in the middle of July. Just watching. Silent. Or the man hood up, jaw locked, that impossible weapon in hand, walking calmly down a street just after a scream had been heard. Sometimes seen dragging something heavy behind him, but no one ever got a clear look. And the monsters began to falter. They didn't vanish, but they changed. They grew frantic, sloppy, not out of hunger, out of fear. They moved faster, attacked quicker, ran sooner. The clean patterns were breaking down, like something had broken their chain of command. Like they weren't just being hunted back, they were being outmatched. Then came the fire on the ridge. No one knows who lit it, but the woods west of Holdwood burned for 2 days. And in the ashes, 3 things were found. A silver locket, belonging to a girl who went missing in 1893. A collapsed tunnel entrance, old, bricked, stamped with mining tags long erased from county records. A mark carved into the last standing tree, low to the ground, right at eye level. It wasn't a name. It wasn't a symbol. It was a sentence, scratched deep and ragged like it was meant to scar. No more. And from that moment on, the bells rang differently. Still loud. Still long. But not a warning. Not a countdown. A declaration. That this land, this county, whatever had claimed it before, was being taken back. Then came the autumn of red skies. The season changed slower that year. Summer clung to the hills like it was afraid to leave, but the air felt off. Not just colder, heavier. Leaves didn't fall. They rotted on the branch. The moon rose early. Too early. And some nights, it was red. Not amber. Red. People whispered again. The kind of whisper that has teeth behind it. Because whatever had held these things back, whatever had kept them cautious, it wasn't enough anymore. The monsters didn't just return. They descended. All at once. Like they were following orders. Not the careful stalkings, not the old, patient method of isolating and vanishing a victim. This was raiding. Brutal, clumsy, fast. Houses ripped open. Barns torn apart. A whole church congregation vanished mid-sermon in East Petersburg, candles still burning, pews still warm. But it was different this time. Because now, they were running from something too. The survivors began to notice it on the edges of every new attack. Something chased them. Something not quite seen, but there. Shifting in the black between trees. The bell would ring, but softer now. More frequent. Like a pulse. Like breathing. And when the monsters struck, they weren't gloating anymore. They were desperate. Then, out near Safe Harbor, during one of the biggest storms of the decade, a farmer and his 3 sons stood their ground against something with too many arms and not enough face. They were losing, outmatched, until the wind stopped. Dead still. And in that quiet, 2 figures stepped out of the woods. One of them young. Still. Cold like a shuttered grave. The other, all tension and heat and steel. His weapon already raised. No words were spoken. The creature turned to face them and froze. Not out of surprise. Out of recognition. It knew. 2 shots cracked through the storm, one like thunder, one like ice splitting earth. And what was left of that beast wasn't worth burying. The farmer's youngest swore he saw the younger figure lower his weapon and, for just a second, smile. Not at the victory. At the fear he saw in the thing's eyes before it died. And then they vanished again. Word spread fast. Even without radios. Even without phones. The monsters were losing. Not because they were weaker, but because something had finally come along that didn't just fight them. It understood them, knew them, and had decided quietly, absolutely, and without mercy, that they didn't belong anymore. People in the county stopped talking about survival. They started talking about cleansing. Not in the religious sense. In the final one. There was still fear. Still loss. But behind it, finally, there was something else. Hope. Sharp-edged. Unspoken. But real. Because now when the bells rang, the people didn't just listen. They waited. And finally, after decades of fear, blood, and silence, Lancaster County snapped. No more warnings. No more hiding. No more waiting for shadows to pick them off one by one. They were done. Men returned from the war with broken bones and harder minds. Widows who'd buried their own learned how to load shells. The boys who'd once cowered beneath bed sheets now stood taller, rifles in hand, eyes hollow but ready. The county had grown up in the dark, and now it knew how to see in it. A meeting was called, not in any church, not in any hall, but at the edge of the Susquehanna. On a moonless night. By torchlight. Hundreds gathered. No speeches. No pomp. Only purpose. They were going to Delta. Not to study it. Not to pray over it. Not to test the land. They were going to burn it. Wipe it off the map. Salt the ground. Eradicate the root of whatever nightmare had taken root all those years ago. They didn't wear uniforms. They wore work clothes. Coats and boots. Leather gloves. They carried lanterns. Guns. Axes. Oil. They made torches from fence posts. Hauled wagons of pitch and timber. Every road leading west from the county pulsed with firelight and footsteps. They didn't speak much. The air did that for them. And above it all, as they marched, the bells began to toll again. Slow. Rhythmic. One for every soul lost since Delta fell. Gong. 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 And as the county's fury approached the broken line where Delta's dead trees began to rise once more from the earth, they didn't find silence. They found waiting. Because the town was still there. Somehow, against time. Sagging roofs, shattered glass, earth cracked open like bone. The wind didn't move through it. It stopped at the edge. But it was there. All of it. The streets. The mine shaft. The bell tower. Still standing. Still watching. Still alive. The first torch was lit. And just as the flame touched the edge of the broken road, just as boots crossed the final threshold into the forgotten town, the wind came back. Hard. Cold. Wrong. And from somewhere deep in the belly of Delta, beneath the floorboards, under the roots, a sound echoed out. Not the bell. Not a scream. Something deeper. Breathing. They had come to end the nightmare. But the nightmare had just woken up. The first thing they noticed wasn't the cold. It was the silence. No birds. No wind. No insects. Just the sound of boots on dead leaves and the low hiss of torchlight breathing in the dark. The trees at the edge of Delta weren't trees anymore. They were husks, gray, dry, stripped bare as bone. Some had antlers tangled in their branches. Some had faces if you stared long enough. They stepped into the town, one by one, row by row. The buildings leaned like they were watching. Porches bowed inward. Roofs caved like mouths mid-scream. The bell tower stood at the center, black against the sky, leaning slightly, but still upright. Still whole. And then just barely, just beneath it all, they heard it again. That breathing. It didn't come from one place. It came from below. Under the streets. In the dirt. In the foundation of this goddamn town. Like the ground itself was asleep and dreaming something cruel. Still, they moved forward. The torches lit up the fronts of the old homes, casting long shadows that stretched too far, moved too much. Oil was poured. Wood stacked. Cloth soaked and wrapped. Then someone screamed. Not far, 2 rows over, near the old general store. It was sharp, short, cut off fast. The group halted. They turned toward the sound, guns up, light focused. A cluster of 6 peeled off 3 men, a woman, 2 teenage boys. They moved as one, crossing the broken street and fanning out toward the sagging building. It was empty. Still. Doors swinging open. Nothing inside. But on the wall near the entrance, something new had been left behind. A smear of blood in the shape of a hand, but with 7 fingers. They backed out slow. Regrouped. And then, from every corner of Delta, came the sound they'd been dreading. That clicking. Not footsteps. Not growls. Clicks. Like bone on stone. Dozens. Hundreds. All around. The first monster dropped from a rooftop like a sack of rotten meat and landed in the torchlight with a hiss that wasn't a hiss, something wetter. The air shrank around it. Its ribs moved wrong. Its eyes were too deep. Its mouth never stopped moving. It lunged and was met by 3 simultaneous shots. The thing spun, dropped, flailed, got back up. Then 5 more figures emerged from the buildings. Crawling, staggering, walking on knuckles. One crawled down the side of a chimney like a spider. And that was when the fire began. The oil caught fast, climbing walls, leaping from house to house. Smoke rolled through the street like fog with a purpose. Screams filled the night, not just from people. The monsters hated fire. They didn't charge. They recoiled, hissed, backed off. But not far. They circled. The residents held their lines. Fired where they could. Torched what they couldn't. The mill workers swung hammers. The hunters shot straight. The farmers brought scythes. But for every creature that fell, another took its place. Something deeper was holding them back. Controlling the flow. Testing. Waiting. And above it all, the bell rang again. Once. Twice. Then 3 times. And from the black maw of the old mine shaft at the center of town, something began to rise. They weren't done. Not by a long shot. The wind shifted. The smoke, thick and clawing, pulled suddenly to the east as if something massive had drawn breath. The fires snapped sideways. Ash flew like snow. The creatures paused. Mid-motion. Mid-hunt. Mid-screech. Because they felt it first. From the tree line behind the town, where the old road had long given up and turned to weeds, came the sound of slow, steady footsteps. Not fast. Not panicked. Just constant. Iron in the rhythm. Intent in the silence. 2 shapes walked through the smoke. The first a man. Late 20s, maybe. Hard to tell with the shadows clinging to him like armor. Denim jacket stained with old soot, sleeves rolled, boots loud against the packed dirt. His hands hung low, loose, casual, but ready. One of them held something that shouldn't exist yet. Something future-born. A .44 Magnum, scarred and dulled from too much use. It gleamed once in the firelight like a warning. His face unreadable. Eyes locked dead ahead. The second figure stood beside him but felt like he came from a different world. A boy, not a child, not quite grown but already cut from the cold of something much older. He wore the tattered coat of a revolutionary scout, high collar up against the wind, the faint shimmer of frost trailing behind him with every step. One hand held a rusted musket slung low. The other gripped a hatchet so old, it looked like it had bled more centuries than men. His eyes glowed faint blue, like the last light of dusk reflecting off ice. Neither of them spoke. But the creatures knew. The outer ring of monsters began to scatter, shuddering back into the alleys and roofs. A few held their ground too long. One let out a high, barking scream, half challenge, half panic, and leapt toward the boy. The musket fired once. It didn't hit the thing. It ended it. The creature dropped mid-air, its chest hollowed out like something ancient had called in a dead. The man followed with his own shot, the magnum roaring across the block like thunder in metal. Another monster's head snapped back, exploded against brick, left a trail the color of ink and bone dust. The line held. The people of Lancaster, bloodied, burned, near breaking, looked toward the two figures now walking into Delta like it belonged to them. And maybe it did. Because the Blue Raven and Johnny, though no one spoke those names, weren't men of myth. Not to the monsters. Not anymore. They were reality. And reality had finally come to collect. The creatures began to pull back, regrouping near the mine shaft, their shrieks growing more erratic, more afraid. But the ground still trembled. Because what was rising from beneath Delta? That wasn't afraid. That hadn't shown its face in a long, long time. And the battle was far from over. One of the creatures charged. It bolted from the shadows near the collapsed grain store, long-limbed, bone-thin, and faster than anything should have been. It dropped low, claws stretched, jaws wide. A scream followed it, high, garbled, animal. And then the man stepped forward. He didn't rush. He walked into it. One shot. The magnum cracked like lightning had hit the street. The creature's face didn't so much explode as cease to exist. Its body tumbled past him, skidding, twitching once before going still. The others, watching, waiting for the moment to strike, froze. You could see it in their bodies. The hesitation. The fear. The recognition. And that's when the man looked up. Smoke curled behind him. The bell still echoed faintly above, the fires burning hot and deep in the bones of Delta. He adjusted the grip on his weapon, gaze scanning the things now backing away into the alleys and ash. And then he said it. Low. Calm. Not a shout. Not for the crowd. Just stated. Welcome to Lancaster County, nightmares. The wind picked up right after. Hard. Cold. The frost around the boy thickened. Machines long dead in the old mill behind them groaned once as if something ancient had breathed down their rusted throats. The battle wasn't slowing. The ground near the mine shaft was cracking open. Something else was coming. Bigger. Older. Worse. But the tone had shifted. Because the monsters had stepped into the county thinking it was prey. Now they were learning painfully whose land they had trespassed on. And it wasn't done with them yet. The mine shaft split open like a wound. First came the sound, deep, guttural, wrong. Like the earth itself was being torn inside out. Bricks cracked. Metal groaned. The wooden support beams snapped like twigs, flying out with enough force to impale a man clean through. Smoke poured upward, not black, but dark red, like rust ground into steam. Then came the things. Not the hunters that had plagued Lancaster for decades. No, these were worse. Bigger. Older. Their limbs too long, their bodies stretched like meat left too long in the sun. Antlers grown into twisted halos, mouths that opened in segments, multiple segments, each one full of teeth. No eyes. Just bone. Armor-like. Slow-moving but heavy, like they brought gravity with them. The townsfolk broke ranks for the first time. Just for a second. Until the boy, frost trailing from his coat, face calm, eyes burning blue, stepped forward and raised the musket again. He didn't fire. He just stared into the red haze pouring from the mouth of the mine. And the fire near the shaft shifted. The flames bent toward the boy, toward the cold, and didn't burn him. The creatures shrieked, all of them. Every monster still alive in the town. Their screams harmonized into one long, sharp, inhuman sound. It shattered windows, split eardrums, dropped people to their knees. But not him. Not the man beside him. He was already moving quick, brutal, efficient. The magnum lit up again, then again. Each shot hit with the weight of a hammer. One of the larger beasts took two to the chest and fell with a sound like trees breaking during a storm. He ducked behind a collapsed wagon, reloaded faster than his hands should have allowed, came up firing. Behind him, the residents were recovering, rallying. Fire still in their hands, fear beaten into something usable. One of the older hunters hurled a torch straight into the chest of a crawling nightmare, and when it flailed, three more cut it down with blades and shovels and everything else they had. The boy advanced toward the mine, slow and steady, frost creeping across the dirt like veins. His breath was visible now, even though the air was still thick with smoke and flame. The ground around him froze solid. One of the large creatures took notice, stepped toward him, jaws splitting like a blooming wound. It didn't make it 2 steps. The hatchet flashed once, clean, and the thing's leg crumpled. It didn't fall. It evaporated, turned to powder before it hit the ground. And still the bell tolled again, and again, and again. The sound grew louder, deeper, closer. But it wasn't in the tower anymore. It was coming from beneath. The monsters weren't attacking now. They were defending. Pulling back. Forming ranks in front of the mine like they were trying to stop something from getting out. And the man in the jacket, reloading calmly, just smiled barely. Almost like he'd seen this before. Like he knew this was only the beginning. The ground stopped shaking. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was pause. Smoke rolled through the streets in heavy ribbons, catching on collapsed beams and broken door frames. The fires still burned, but lower now, controlled, purposeful, held back from the mine as if something in the flames understood where to stop. The mine's mouth no longer bled red light. It breathed a slow, fading exhale, and whatever had stirred deep beneath Delta wasn't rising. Not now. Not yet. The larger creatures, the warped elders of the pack, lay dead or scattered, their twisted limbs twitching in the ash. One had tried to climb the bell tower in the confusion. It never made it halfway up. The top half of its body had been found impaled through a blackened fence post. And the rest of them, gone. Not retreated. Vanished. Dragged into cracks. Melted into trees. Dissolved in the cold mist now swallowing the deeper corners of town. What few remained had been hunted to their end, burned, hacked, shot, or left twitching for the carrion to pick clean. The people of Lancaster stood in the quiet ruins of Delta, bloodied, shaken, but alive. Some fell to their knees. Some wept. Some just stood there, gripping tools and torches like if they let go, it might all start again. The wind was still now. The bell had stopped. And in the center of it all stood the two of them. The boy coated in frost, blood frozen along the fringe of his sleeves, had gone still, musket at his side. His breath no longer steamed. The cold around him slowly receded, crawling back into the seams of the earth like a ghost returning to its den. Beside him, the man lowered the revolver, clicked open the chamber. 6 spent shells dropped into the dirt like a punctuation mark. He looked at what was left of the mine. Looked at the bell tower. Looked at the people. And then turned his back. No speech. No thanks. No warning. Just gone. The boy followed soon after, vanishing like the fog itself had called him home. His footprints in the ash turned to frost, then to water, then to nothing. And the residents, those who survived, stood at the edge of the broken town, looking at the ruins, looking at the mine. They didn't speak. They didn't cheer. Because deep down, they all knew what this was. Not the end. Just the close of a chapter. The creatures were gone. But the place remained. And places like this don't forget. They remember. And sometimes, they wait. It began without a word. One of the younger men, barely 20, soot still fresh on his sleeves, walked to the edge of the mine shaft. Looked down. No monsters. No sound. Just blackness. He took the lantern from his belt, pulled the wick high, and without hesitation, dropped it in. There was a moment of stillness. Then a soft thwomp. Then more. Dozens of hands moved. Torches thrown. Oil barrels tipped. Cloth bundles lit and hurled into windows, doorways, alley gaps. Fire spread fast, not wild this time, not chaotic. Planned. Like the town itself had been waiting for permission to finally die. The flames roared through the wreckage. Houses caught quick. Roofs dropped in like folded paper. Walls peeled back. One by one, the buildings collapsed, not just burned, but consumed. The bell tower went last. It stood longer than it should have, creaking, groaning, holding out like a monument refusing surrender. Then the wind shifted, and the base gave way. It came down slow, almost reluctant, and when it hit the ground, the sound that followed wasn't a crash. It was a relief. No cheers. No applause. Just the low murmur of fire swallowing old sins. Smoke rose into the dawn. The skies, painted in soft gray and orange, opened above the ruins as if the sun had finally been given leave to return. For the first time in memory, the shadows weren't watching. And Delta was no longer a town. It was a memory on fire. The residents stood at its edge until the heat pushed them back. Some walked. Some limped. Some were carried. But they all left together. No one stayed behind. They never rebuilt. They never returned. The ashes of Delta blew across Lancaster County for days. It stained clothes, settled in fields, got caught in the cracks of porches and the corners of school desks. But no one brushed it away. It was a reminder, a warning, a victory paid in generations. And deep underground, beneath where the flames could reach, beneath even the mine, something old curled tighter, wounded, silent, waiting. But above, for now, in the land it had once ruled, there was peace. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way Lancaster County hadn't known in years. No bells. No screams. No disappearances. The fog lifted. The animals returned. Farms stopped losing livestock overnight. Children played near tree lines that once swallowed grown men whole. And every town in the region, Little Britain, Holdwood, Millersville, Bard, even the outer reaches of Lancaster City itself breathed in unison for the first time in living memory. The silence wasn't hollow. It was earned. The old families met again. Not in fear but to rebuild. Barns were patched. Churches cleaned. The burned corners of farmland were resown. Some people moved away. Some stayed. But everyone knew, whether they admitted it or not, they had won. Not against monsters. Against history. Against something woven so deep into the dirt that it took fire, blood, and the will of an entire county to rip it out by the root. And no one ever said the names of the two figures who helped turn the tide. They weren't mentioned in the newspapers. They weren't given medals. They weren't even seen again, not really. But stories stuck. Stories of a man with eyes like burning steel and a weapon that didn't belong. Stories of a boy who walked with winter in his coat and silence in his hands. Stories of how the monsters knew them, feared them before they ever fired a shot. And in the years to come, when strange things almost stirred, when shadows almost moved, when someone thought they heard a bell far off in the distance but could never quite place the sound, they didn't panic. They just whispered, Let them try again. And kept working the land.